Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. And today we're talking energy, of course, in Wyoming. And joining me now is Pete Obermueller. He is the president of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Pete, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Happy to talk oil and gas in Wyoming. It's obviously super important to Wyoming. Oil and gas is really the number one economic driver for the state in terms of really any measure you can come up with: GDP, employment, payroll, tax revenue, any of that. Oil and gas tops the list by a long shot. So the Petroleum Association of Wyoming is the trade association that represents everyone from start to finish who is in the oil and gas business in Wyoming. So that includes the companies that go out and explore for new resources, and then the companies that actually drill for them and bring them to the surface, the companies that transport that resource across the country and the world, and then the companies that refine them into products that we use every day, and all the people who surround it that make it work: wildlife biologists, environmental consultants, attorneys, and others who make sure that that whole process works from start to finish. So that's who we represent in Wyoming, and I'm proud to do it.
And so if you can, let's talk about the state of the oil and gas industry in Wyoming, like especially right now versus, say, sometime over the last 10 years. How would you compare it?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride over the past few years, like it's been for everybody. You rewind to 2019, and things were going pretty well. We had, I think, somewhere in the order of 31, 33 rigs running in Wyoming, drilling for oil and gas. The pandemic hit, and of course, the government shutdowns as a reaction to the pandemic, and all the demand destruction because of those shutdowns. And in the summer, in July of 2020, Wyoming's operators laid down all of their rigs. The first time we've had zero rigs running in Wyoming since 1884. So that was not a great time. And we knew, once demand came rushing back, as we knew it would when those restrictions lifted, that it would be a little difficult for us to come back up, because it's not just for us; it's a process to get rigs back up and get people back on those rigs and all that. So it took time, and it's still taking time. We're at, I think, 13 rigs running today. So obviously quite a bit smaller than we were in 2019. But I will say that the oil and gas industry has changed so much over the course of the last 10 years, 20 years, obviously the last 100 years, that it used to be that you kind of knew how much production was happening in an area or in a state based on that rig count, whether there's 30 or 13 or 400 or however many. But now that the technology has grown so much, where you can get so much more oil out of the ground with one single well, that rig count isn't really a good proxy anymore. We can get a lot of production out of 13 wells. So it's a little bit of bad, a little bit of good. Right now, I think the prices are fine. People are coming back to work. Our employment is strong again, up around 20,000 Wyomingites employed by the industry, and so it's going better. But we still can do some work, and a hell of a ways to go.
And do you happen to know if there's hiring going on in the industry right now?
Oh yeah, there's definitely hiring. For a while there, particularly 2021, 2022, we struggled like everybody else after the pandemic to encourage people to come back to work. And what was interesting is a lot of the challenges for other industries in Wyoming has been kind of keeping up with the pay scale. You can have pretty great careers in oil and gas, really high paying careers in oil and gas, and that was a challenge for other industries to keep pace. We didn't reduce any of that pay. In fact, we increased it in a lot of ways, but it was just difficult to encourage people to come back to work, and that is slowly rebounded. And so we're still, oil and gas is still hiring, and oil field service still hiring and all that. So yeah, we're constantly looking for more workers.
And for people that are watching this and they say, hey, maybe I'll look for a job in the oil and gas industry, where do they go to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, it totally depends on your skill set and what you're interested in doing. But I would suggest we have a lot of great partnerships with Wyoming's Department of Workforce Services. They're the ones who kind of help connect the dots sometimes. Industry is involved in various work fairs or at the University of Wyoming. We do a lot with graduating students as well. So there's opportunities all around there. And then, depending on your skill set, maybe you're a CDL driver or want to get that. There's all sorts of other parts of the business that aren't about being on a rig. You got water trucks and all that sort of stuff too. So there's plenty of opportunity, and I would suggest that folks go to Department of Workforce Services and help connect those dots.
So during the pandemic, when Wyoming went to zero rigs, what happened to the people that worked for them? What happened to the businesses that were involved?
Yeah.
Did people go out of business? Did they pause? What did they do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was a real challenge for us because I mean, you think about it's a basic rule of thumb that every rig has about 100 people attached to it that make it work. But those rigs are very mobile and they go to where the production is. So they don't necessarily stay in Wyoming. They go to North Dakota or down in New Mexico or Texas, and we were really in jeopardy of losing a lot of those people. Some of them are mobile anyway, but some of them are really they're in Wyoming, they have family in Wyoming, they're attached to Wyoming and didn't really want to leave, but we're looking at a situation where they might be forced to. So we tried to with the governor's help and the legislature's help, we instituted some programs during that time where we tried to funnel a lot more of our resources, industry paid resources, and then also some of that money that the federal government sent down to everybody to really put a lot of emphasis on reclaiming old wells or land that needed to be reclaimed so that people who would normally work on rigs when those weren't up for price reasons had work to do, and we could keep them here so that we could stand it back up later. And that had some reasonable success. There was no way we could combat the demand destruction totally, but that had some reasonable success and was really I got word from a lot of small local operators in Rock Springs or Riverton and others who said this thing kept my business afloat for a year and a half. I wouldn't have survived without it, and now we're back doing what we like to do, which is produce oil and gas.
Since the Biden administration took control in Washington, you've heard certain limitations they've wanted to place on drilling on federal land, things like
Mhm.
that. How has that
Mhm.
impacted Wyoming?
It has been, the Biden administration took their time on making these changes, and which surprised us. We sort of thought, particularly given the campaign rhetoric, that there would be a lot immediately. And you remember in the first days that the administration issued a moratorium on leasing, stopped leasing entirely, and then they restarted it, and then they took some time. And really, the truth of that is they took time to dig deep into these rules and figure out how to layer them and try to make them sustainable in even in a next administration if it's not if it's Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden trying to make them sustainable. So it took them time. But now it's really coming to a head, and you can see it in some of these rules. Initially, they started just really reducing that leasing, and that's an important point that I don't think it's unique to Wyoming because, in some ways, because Wyoming is really still, if you can believe it, I mean, PW has been around for 100 years, but if you can believe it, Wyoming is still a little exploratory for oil and gas. The Powder River Basin in Wyoming is the hot spot, but it's still exploratory. We don't know the outer edges of that basin. It really stretches our technology to access that resource. So we're still exploring. And the only way you can explore is with leases, federal leases. And if the federal government continues to do what it has been doing now for 3 years under Biden, is choke off that very starting point, those leases, then down the road, the pipeline of what we can produce shuts off. So we've been working hard on that. But then more recently, just more really concerning ones that I just want to mention real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just a couple weeks ago, They issued a new rule. It does a lot of different stuff on kind of the federal leasing program, but one specific one that's really troubling for Wyoming, particularly Wyoming small operators, is they changed the bonding rules. So I don't want to bore you to tears, but real quickly, what bonding is, of course, is you a company has to bond at the beginning of the process so that if something happens to that company and they walk away from their well, that well needs to be reclaimed and all that, and the bond makes sure that that company is responsible for it instead of taxpayers, which is totally fair. What the BLM did, however, is they increased the minimum bond amount by 1,400%, not matched by any sort of reasonable risk of whether or not companies in Wyoming will actually abandon their wells. It's like 0.00021% chance that a
Right.
well will be abandoned. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. And what they did is say, look, we think every single one of these wells is going to be abandoned, and we think that the bond amount should cover the entire reclamation amount. And so we are just talking to an operator just yesterday or the day before from Central Wyoming who had his bond amount increased from $300,000 to 4.1 million. So
So
big
what did he
companies.
do? I mean, and then we were
Well,
talking
that
we're talking surety bonds here.
yeah, yeah. Well, so that's the thing. It's a surety bond, and so what the BLM says and other people say is they're like, well, what are you worried about? You get a surety bond and you're just paying a fraction. They're not asking you for actually 4.1 million in cash. The trouble is like 80% of Wyoming's oil and gas operators are small businesses, mom and pop operations that produce very small amounts of oil. They're locked out of the surety market. They can't go get a surety bond. The only thing they can do is put that up in cash. So if they don't have that cash, just talking to a guy right before you and I jumped on who said, I'm going to have to like the bond I put in now I took from my own savings. I can't come up with this kind of money. So they're in this situation of if this stands, of really deciding like, do I go into some pretty serious debt to keep these marginal wells going, or do I walk away? Which is really ironic because the BLM says the whole reason for doing this is because we're worried about people abandoning their wells, but the rule itself will force people to abandon their wells. It's pretty dramatic, and it's important for Wyoming because I mean, you've heard it. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure your listeners have heard it. The narrative about big oil, and people have like the giant multinational companies in mind. Wyoming doesn't really have that. We don't have big oil. We have a full third of our production is from tiny companies that make up 1% or less of the total production by themselves. So, Wyoming just has, 300 or more of these small companies that are really, really under threat by this rule. So I'm pretty focused on it right now. You can tell I'm kind of a little passionate about it. I'm really worried about these small mom and pop Wyoming operators who live in these communities and are just trying to make a living and provide a little energy for people who need it.
Yeah, and it is a big deal. My uncle owns a surety bonding company, actually.
Ah,
So I completely get the industry. I totally understand it. He's been doing it for more than 40 years, based out of New Jersey, but they do business in about 17 states.
nice, nice.
Yeah.
Maybe he can come take care of our people out here.
I'm going to talk to him about this. I'm definitely going to talk to him about this tomorrow. I can assure you of that. So Pete, let's switch gears for a second and talk about
Yeah,
carbon storage if we can.
yeah,
What is that?
yeah. It's interesting. It's funny. It's funny to watch from Wyoming. Everybody kind of talk about it, and in some cases freak out about it because in Wyoming we've been doing carbon storage for a long, 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 long time in two different ways. So you may be surprised to know that just straight CO2 store, like permanent storage underground, Wyoming has the largest capture facility in the world. And in Wyoming, we capture and store a full quarter of the entire globe's CO2 sequestration capacity. And that's been happening for 40 years in Sublette County at the Exxon facility, where they capture CO2 and some others, and they produce helium and all that, but they've been capturing it there for a long, long time, about 40 years or more. So that's number one. But number two, the thing that people don't really think about is when a company drills for oil and gas, for oil in particular, obviously it varies depending on a lot of things, but in general, you can kind of expect you're going to get 10 to 15% of the oil out of the ground just from your initial pressure and hydraulic lift and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to do other things to stimulate that reservoir and get more oil out. And one of the most effective ways of getting more oil out of the ground is injecting CO2. So we call it enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, you might hear people say. And so you inject CO2, you get another 10 to 15% of oil out of that basin or out of that reservoir, and then you capture that CO2 and you keep kind of re-injecting it in this loop. And at the end of that cycle, when that reservoir is you're done with the economics of that reservoir, then that CO2 is actually stored down there permanently. So again, CO2 storage for enhanced oil recovery, which we've been doing for 30 or 40 years in Wyoming also. So it's fascinating to me in two ways. One, the national narrative, particularly out of DC about CO2 is, oh my goodness, it's this waste. We gotta figure out how to deal with this waste product. Well, Wyoming is like we've viewed CO2 as a commodity this whole time because we need it and we need access to it in order to get more out of our oil fields. So talking about it as a waste is weird to me. But then we also have this other narrative on the other side saying, well, CO2 storage is untested and unsafe and all this sort of stuff. And I'm looking around thinking, well, in Wyoming, there's nobody in the world better at doing this than in Wyoming. We have more experience, more knowledge, the best workforce and all that related to CO2 storage. So kind of neither narrative is really the truth right now.
Fantastic. Really interesting. I didn't know that about Wyoming, but it's great to know, and it's great to understand the concept a little bit better than I did before. So Pete, for people that want to learn more about your organization, where can they go?
Yeah, so our website's probably the best place to go. It's pawyo.org. It's pawyo.org. It's lots of stuff on there, but there's a couple good ones I'd point people to. There's an oil and gas 101, which just kind of gives, there's a glossary, gives lots of jargon. You can figure out what people are talking about, but then also a lot of interesting information just about Wyoming's oil and gas industry. And then also there's a facts and figures page on there that kind of goes into a little bit more what I was saying about our tax revenue and our GDP and how many wells are operating in Wyoming and all of that. So just some real basic stuff. And then we also have a subsidiary site called Powering Wyoming's Potential that goes into basin specific stuff. So talking about the PRB again, you can go in and kind of get a little bit more information, particularly if you live in that area, about what's going on underneath your feet. What the formations look like, what operators are up to there, and what some of the challenges are, and that kind of thing. But lots of information on our website. I'd encourage people to check it out.
Super informative, Pete. Thank you so much. So people that want to learn more about Wyoming and what's going on, just go to wyliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Pete, we really appreciate your time. You really educated me. I learned a lot.
That's great. Really happy to do it. Thanks for inviting me.
You bet.